Chapter 2. Unable to speak, unable to see, and unable to move, I lost all sense of time. Had it been an hour, 2, or only 15 minutes? I drifted in and out of thought, occasionally giving a half-hearted test against the ropes that bound me, but had no luck in getting any of them to loosen. I was hesitant to struggle too much. The quartermaster was still in the room with me, and he was disturbingly quiet when he so chose. If nothing else, my figurative isolation gave me some time to try and calm myself and consider my options, few though they were. The wisest thing to do, perhaps, was to behave as the quartermaster had suggested, and simply wait to be returned home after everything played out. I might have done just that, if I was more certain that it would be that easy. I was familiar with some accounts of pirate activities, and had read stories of abductions and ransoms, situations similar to my own. While the victims of those abductions were sometimes returned to their families unharmed, this was not always the case. I felt rather certain that it would not be the case for me either, given my circumstances. I wondered, did these pirates have any idea who I was? The quartermaster had seemed to know that I was of noble birth at the least, but that wouldn't have been hard to discern from my clothing, not to mention the high price of passage on the ship I was stolen from. Were they at all aware of what they had stumbled into? Perhaps, had they chanced to grab some other noble woman, their plan to ransom her and make a neat sum would have gone off without a hitch. But me... I let out a shaky exhale. Pirates were no strangers to taking risks, but only to a certain point. If something went wrong, where would that leave us? What would they do with me? Would they simply cut their losses and slit my throat at the first sign of trouble? Feeling the fear begin to swell up in my chest again, I tried fruitlessly to calm myself down. First things first, regardless of what happened next, I refused to spend the entire voyage trussed up like this. The ropes were beginning to become painful as they dug into my wrists, and I longed to at least move my legs to get some feeling back into them. But if I wanted to try and convince anyone to untie me, I was going to have to watch my tongue. After debating internally for a few minutes, I decided that now was as good a time as any, and that I was better off trying my luck with a pirate I already knew, rather than waiting for a shift change. Summoning my courage, I began to whimper softly into my gag. There was no response. Not to be deterred, I got louder, wriggling in my bonds for good measure. I heard him sigh, and after a second, the blindfold was yanked from my eyes. He looked annoyed.
In case it wasn't clear,
he said,
I gagged you so you would be quiet.
I resisted the urge to glare at him, and instead lifted my eyes up to try and make them as wide and pitiful as possible, letting out a few more muffled whimpers. His scoff told me that he hadn't bought the act, but began removing the gag anyway. Thank you, I forced myself to say, as soon as he'd withdrawn his hands. He only grunted in response, and tucked the small bundle of fabric into his pocket, where he could easily retrieve it if he decided he was tired of hearing me speak again. Racking my brains for something else to say, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Since we'll be spending some time together, perhaps you could tell me what I should call you, I said. He raised an eyebrow.
You want something,
he guessed. I swallowed hard, thrown off. He certainly didn't beat around the bush. Even so, I made another attempt. Yes, I want to know your name. I said carefully.
Grayson,
he said gruffly.
What do you really want?
With a sigh of frustration, I abandoned the pretense altogether. Please untie me, I said. He shook his head.
Can't do that.
I bit back the sharp retort that was aching to roll off my tongue, and tried my best to keep my tone as polite as possible. My arms and legs are starting to feel numb, and I would appreciate a trip to wherever it is that you relieve yourselves, I told him. Grayson seemed to consider this for a moment, eyes scanning me, before abruptly getting up and making his way towards the door.
Wait here,
he grumbled over his shoulder just as he exited the room. When he was gone, I rolled my eyes. Wait here, as though I had a choice. It was only a few minutes before he came back, drawing a knife from his belt.
Let me be clear,
he warned, holding the blade in front of me to accentuate his point.
Try anything funny, and you'll regret it. Understood?
Yes. With a nod, he reached down and began slicing the ropes from my ankles and legs, and then my wrists. My shoulders burned as I finally moved my arms back to my sides, and I couldn't stifle a sigh of relief. Eager to move, I tried quickly to get to my feet, only to have my knees wobble and give out. Strong hands caught me by the shoulders, and I found myself suddenly and unsettlingly close to my captor.
Careful,
he said, with a hint of a smile. I swallowed hard and pushed away, regaining my balance. My legs were a bit stiffer than I thought they'd be, but this time I managed to stay upright, straightening and smoothing out my dress with as much dignity as I could muster. Discomfited, I tried to step away from him, making a move towards the door on the other side of the room. Grayson blocked my path with an outstretched arm. He collected both my wrists in one of his hands, bringing them together in front of me. And then, with impressive speed, he produced a small length of rope from one of his pockets and began winding it around them. I scowled at my hands in dismay as the ropes immediately began to irritate my already raw skin. Is that truly necessary? I couldn't help asking. He locked his gaze with mine again, and the smile this time was more pronounced as his eyes glinted at me, sparkling with something like mischief.
Cautionary measures,
he said, and without breaking eye contact, closed the final knot, inadvertently pulling me closer. Or was it on purpose? I couldn't be sure, but the upwards curl of his mouth seemed to suggest as much. A length of the cord still dangled from my wrists, and he took hold of the end and gave it a tug.
This way,
he said, turning back towards the door. I felt my cheeks turn a shade of bright red as I realized that he intended to lead me like this, like a dog on a leash. But it was clear that I had little say in the matter. As much as my body screamed for me to resist, I had no choice but to play along and follow. We stepped out of the room that had served as my prison, and came into a small, narrow hallway with a low ceiling, which reeked of must, salt, and mold. Grayson took a sharp turn to the left, yanking me along with him. As I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a staircase that appeared to lead above deck, and found myself vaguely wondering how far away from shore we were now. Depending on the answer, freedom was either just at the top of those stairs, or miles out of my reach. He led me through the hallway, and past a few openings in the walls, through which I caught glimpses of some other parts of the ship, including what looked like some kind of recreational area, and some makeshift living quarters, complete with several bedrolls splayed haphazardly across the floor. We came to a door at the end of the hallway, and when he opened it, he brought me into a room much larger than the one we'd come from, with a dusty carpet thrown across the floor and a desk towards the far end. A bed was shoved into one corner of the room, and then another smaller door on the left wall. Grayson released the end of my leash and opened said door, gesturing mockingly. I folded my mouth into a hard line. I supposed he wasn't planning to let me have full use of my hands for this. Annoying, but fine. I gathered up my skirts as best I could, before carefully stepping inside. The door closed behind me. Granted, it was much cleaner than I had expected it to be. I did what I needed to do, and then exited the small lavatory. Grayson caught hold of the end of the rope again, turning back towards the door we'd come through. He didn't even have time to move before the door burst open, and a man came sprinting through, the echo of distant shouts chasing after him. He better fit the stereotypical description of a pirate, with a kerchief tied over his head and a face coated in a layer of sweat and grease.
"A problem up on deck, sir,"
he said, out of breath. Grayson frowned.
What is it?
"Wilkes and Peter, they're fighting again."
Oh, for the love of...
He made a vague gesture back towards me.
I'm busy.
At this, the pirate seemed to notice me for the first time. He swallowed and gave me a short, awkward nod.
"Right, sorry, it's just that,
He glanced nervously over his shoulder.
They've drawn pistols, and..."
What?
Grayson swore, looking at the door and then back at me, torn. He made a sound that laid somewhere between a sigh and a growl, and then he suddenly seized my arm, dragging me towards the desk. I began to protest. "What are you doing?" My words dissolved into a yelp as he shoved me down into the chair, hurriedly using the loose length of rope hanging from my wrists to bind my hands to the chair's right arm.
I'll be right back,
he grunted, before whirling around and stalking back out into the hallway. The other pirate shot me a furtive glance, then turned to follow. The door slammed shut behind them. Dazed, I looked down and gave my wrists a tug. They didn't budge. I spent a few moments twisting and turning in a futile attempt to free myself, but despite the rush he'd been in, Grayson still knew what he was doing. All of the knots were out of my reach. I let out a breath, shaking a loose strand of hair from my forehead. I nearly leapt out of my chair, my head jerked up towards the ceiling from where the sound had come. Was that a gunshot? The sound was promptly followed by more shouting, and then the pounding of footsteps over top of my head. The sensation of 1,000 tiny needles pricking me all over assaulted my senses, as the reality of my situation began to dawn on me. This ship was full of men who would shoot each other over something as trivial as a petty argument. Men who made their way in life by pillaging and robbing others. Men who would almost certainly toss me overboard the moment they realized who I was. This time, it was impossible to stop the panic from sinking in. I felt my chest constricting, my lungs caving in on themselves, my breaths shortening as the shouting continued. These pirates had no idea what they'd done, no idea what kind of trouble they had brought upon themselves, that they had dragged me into. One way or another, I was going to die on this ship. Trying to breathe, my eyes began to flicker around the room desperately, and landed on the desk directly in front of me. A letter opener was half buried beneath a stack of papers. Another gunshot prompted me to action. I grabbed hold of the chair as best I could, and jerked it closer to the desk. But no matter how much I pulled and strained, I couldn't quite reach the letter opener. clenching my teeth and repressing the fearful sobs that threatened to rise from my throat, I jammed my knee against the desk, trying to knock the letter opener closer. The impact resonated through my bones unpleasantly, but I repeated the action regardless. The letter opener eventually leapt out from underneath the papers. With some difficulty, I managed to grab it. I sawed furiously through the ropes holding me down, skin burning. The blade was about as sharp as a butter knife, but somehow I managed to get it all the way through one of the cords, loosening the bonds again for me to pull myself free. I jumped out of the chair, and then found myself frozen. Now what? I was trapped on this ship with murderous pirates in the middle of the ocean. There was nowhere to run. Mind and heart racing both, I cracked open the door to check that the coast was clear, and then started back down the hallway towards the staircase that I assumed led above deck. Reaching its base, I carefully peered up. The brightness of the sky was nearly blinding, but I could hear men shouting over one another. I didn't care much to listen to exactly what they were fighting about. The only thought going through my head was that they were all distracted. I inched my way up the stairs, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding so loudly that a part of me was foolishly afraid they might hear. But none of them was so much as looking in my direction, let alone listening. They all seemed to be crowded towards the end of the deck. Beyond them stood two men, with pistols drawn. I arrived at the top of the stairs, and took stock of my surroundings. The side of the ship was just a few feet to my right. Behind me, the quarterdeck, and in front of me, the intense standoff. I cast my gaze back to the right. It was my only real option. I hesitated a moment, as the logical side of my brain tried to take over and informed me that this was a bad idea. But I argued in return. There was no other escape. I could either stay on this ship and face whatever awful fate awaited me, and let's be honest, I told myself, I won't like it. Or I could take my chances and swim. I didn't leave time to feel afraid. I bolted for the side of the ship and, holding my breath, threw myself over it. The plunge was painful in more ways than one. The sheer distance from the deck to the water had to have been at least 50 feet, and the impact stung my skin. Then there was the cold. It seeped immediately through my clothing, sinking watery teeth into my skin and chilling me directly to my bones, paralyzing me for several crucial seconds before I was finally able to move. I forced my arms to action, eventually propelling myself to the surface, fighting against the raging waves. I was a good swimmer. Years of growing up in a city near the shore had given me that much at least. Gasping for air, I threw a glance over my shoulder towards the ship. Unsurprisingly, the men had heard the splash and come running. I couldn't hear them over the roar of the waves and the slosh of seawater in my ears. But I knew that I had to move fast. With any luck, I could flag another ship down. Surely we weren't terribly far from Calais, where the Oasis had left port. This time of year, there were plenty of transporters and merchants sailing back and forth. All I had to do was hold out until... A surface wave crashed on top of me and forced me back into the water's icy jaws. I fought to come back up, coughing up as much salt water as I could before trying to swim once more. The current fought back more than I expected, my arms and legs growing tired, until I was struggling to remain afloat more than I was swimming. There was a splash from somewhere behind me, but before I could even think about looking, I was pulled under once again. My eyes stung and blurred, and I struggled to get back to the surface. This time, no matter how hard I seemed to work my arms, I couldn't feel the air. I couldn't see. My body screamed for oxygen, and finally, unable to hold my breath any longer, my mouth opened and water flowed into my lungs. I tried to cough, my vision already darkening, and the entire world spinning impossibly fast around me. I made one last feeble attempt to propel myself upwards before finally the dizziness overtook me and everything began fading away. Something clasped itself around my right wrist and pulled hard. And that was the last thing I felt before I lost consciousness.